I'm Andrew. I am not on the AngularJS team, but I do work here and I use AngularJS in my project, so it's kind of close enough, and I help organize this meetup. If you don't know, AngularJS is a JavaScript framework for building web applications. It's sort of an MVC-ish framework. It has two-way data binding, and you sort of build your application declaratively in markup. Those are the main points, but we'll get more into that in the presentation. A couple informational things. From now on, the meetups are going to be on the third Tuesday of the month, every month, just so you guys will know when it's going to be rather than us just picking a random day that works out. So the next one's going to be October 16th. Other thing is we sort of want to get everyone here more integrated into the meetups. So we want to do some lightning demos, some like 5-minute or less demos from you guys, just to share like what you're working on, just show like a single web page and what you're having problems with, or what something really cool. It doesn't have to be like a huge project or an impressive application, just to sort of introduce yourself and show what you're doing. I'll post more information about that on meetup.com. Presentations today. Karl is going to present on directives, which is sort of how you build your application in markup, but he'll talk about that. And then Adam and James from HBO are going to talk about a cool solution they came up with for rendering AngularJS templates on the server side for SEO. So when a search engine crawls their website, it'll come out looking like a website instead of an Angular template, essentially. The last thing is mics. So we have mics for asking questions. Please use them. There's like 70 people here, 60, 50, I don't know. But there's hundreds of people that watch on YouTube. So that's really valuable. So please use the mics. And when I send emails about the lightning demos, if you do a lightning demo, you get a new AngularJS t-shirt. It's pretty cool. So here's Karl.
Well, let's see. Okay. Everyone here? No? Yes? All right, so I'm going to be talking about directives, which are kind of how you extend HTML and add a bunch of capabilities to your site. Angular comes with a bunch of directives. If you've used it at all, you've probably seen like ng repeat or ng class. Like all of those things are directives. So you can use them for stuff like that, for adding simple behaviors to a particular DOM element, or you can use them to even create like vast UI widgets. Basically just a way to drop a reusable component of some sort into your page. I'm going to start with a really simple reminder of Angular. So this is just a very simple page here. It uses Angular Magic's two-way binding, so I can just type, and through the magic of two-way binding, stuff appears down there. Let's quickly go over how that works. So this is the HTML. We have an input with an ng model directive right here that says name, and that basically says this input is bound to the name attribute of our scope, the name property. And then down here we have this name equals curly curly name, and basically that's what drops it into the document. So when I type into the name field up here, the name value spits out down here automatically.
Is it possible to get the browser span?
I have no idea.
Unfortunately not. Not in our technical capabilities.
Apologies. There are TVs in the back also, if that helps. I can see them. So there's something else going on here too. We have div demo greet equals name here. And so what's that? Well, I don't know. Let's find out. Have a look in here in directives.js. Here we define something called demo greet. You'll note that it uses camel case here, and in the HTML it uses a dash. Reason for that is that directives and many other things in Angular, actually mainly directives, use a normalized naming scheme. So you could say demo dash greet or like demo colon greet, or there's all these different ways you can name. You can refer to your directives in HTML that are varyingly standards compliant versus convenient. So you can pick what you can refer to the documentation. There's tons of them. Pick which one is your favorite. My team uses data dash namespace dash directive name, which is compliant with HTML5. Maybe. No, I can't. So, let's see if I can put it closer to my head. Is this better? Okay. So let's have a look at what this directive is doing. It prints out a simple message, and then it writes the text into itself, "Hello world." Not that interesting, but you can see the "Hello world" text right here. So I think it would be good to go over, maybe make it do something a bit more interesting. So let's say I instead wanted it to actually say include that name thing that we had before in the field. So I could say hello world plus headers.demo greet. And then all it says is name. So that's not very interesting, right? That's just the name of the field. If I type here, nothing happens. So instead, I can use $parse, which we've injected up there. I'll explain that in a minute. And we will see, oh my. Yeah, so still a problem with this. Typing up here, still isn't updating. So this will go into another simple basic attribute of Angular, which is watch. So I have this scope variable here that gets passed in as the first argument to my linking function. I'll talk about what a linking function is in a minute. That is the basic data model and the model view controller. And that allows me to share scope between various aspects, various controllers and directives and whatnot. So what I can do to actually hook up to the two-way binding in Angular is say $watch. Headers.demo greet. And all of a sudden, this just works. So Let's talk about linkers. So a very simple directive like this, you just need to return a link function here, and that will be called, for every single one of your times you put your directive into the HTML, this thing will get called. Every time that, if you have it in a repeater, it's going to be called once for every iteration of that repeater. If your widget's a little more complicated, though, there's more stuff you can do. So what actually is going on up here? This up here is actually the compile function, and this is kind of a source of a lot of confusion for new Angular developers. What's the difference between compile and link? The difference is that compile happens before link, and it only happens once if your directive is referred to from a repeater. So if you let's just say. So I've put that guy in a repeater now. So we see him 3 times. Not too interesting at the moment. But what's happened is the linker has been called 3 times. So if your directive is doing something that's even remotely expensive, that's probably bad, right? We want to optimize our directive by moving some common work into the compile area. So a simple example here would be just putting the parser up here, so I can. So if we look at the source code, the string name here is the same every time, and that name refers to the name member of the scope. However, in my repeater, actually let me change this to IDX. So this is going to refer to the IDX member of the scope, and as you would expect, 1, 2, 3. So the value changes for each iteration, and the way that works is that each instance of the repeated element gets its own child scope. So basically, we are taking the same expression IDX and evaluating it against 3 different scopes, 1 for each iteration. So there is some repeated work going on there, and that is that we're basically having to parse this IDX string and like Angular has to parse that and figure out what that means against the scope, or just means not even before it's even thought of what the scope is. It has to figure out what IDX means. So under the hood, when you watch something, it is it uses this same parse service to figure that out. But since my watch is in the link function, I'm basically calling that parse code 3 times. So instead, what I could do is basically just say, parse. Let's look up here. And then instead of watching the string value, I'm just going to watch that expression. The expression is just what comes out of parse is a function that takes scope as an argument. So in fact, when you're watching, you can actually just write your own function that takes scope as an argument, and it works the same way. But what I've done here is just cut out a little bit of work in my widget, and hopefully this works. No. Just a second. Might be misremembering argument order there. Oh. Sorry, I'm misremembering certain aspects of dependency injection. I'm gonna just reset to the next part of the demo to fix this. But basically, you get the idea. You can push common work up into the compile stage if you have something that's even reasonably expensive. It's a good idea to do that if you think your directive is ever going to be used in a repeater. I'm going to get into the digest cycle next. Does anyone have any questions before I do that? Yeah. Do I have one? Oh.
Yeah, I have a very simple question. I'm new to Angular, and I noticed you use the word scope as opposed to dollar scope.
So, yeah, it's just a naming convention, right? So, if you ever want to inject the scope, such as if you're writing a controller, then you refer to it as dollar scope. Basically, whenever you're injecting something that comes from Angular, it's implemented by Angular, or whenever you're using a function that is implemented by Angular, like say scope member functions, they're always prefixed by dollar, basically. So we have this sort of contract that Angular is not going to dump on any of our variables that aren't prefixed by dollar, and we're not going to dump on any of the variables that are prefixed by dollar because those belong to Angular. So, yes. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So what's the difference between compile and prelink? Is it that prelink is run on every iteration?
All right. I wasn't going to mention prelink because it's not that useful most of the time, but basically, so the order of operations is compile, then prelink, then link. So basically, when you have your page, and Angular has a parser that traverses the DOM, and basically what happens is it goes through when it first gets to your node, it calls compile, and then it calls, and then so basically it has compile, and then it makes if it's in a loop, it makes a clone of your node for each loop iteration. If not, it just uses the exact one right there. Calls the prelinker on that one, either the clone or the original, depending on whether you're in a loop, and then descends into it and looks at its children, and then does all this stuff on them too. And then once it's done processing the children, then it calls link. So if you need to effectively do what link would normally, you get all the same. You can do all the same stuff in prelink as you can in link if you want. It's just before the children have been processed.
Okay. And my second question is, when you're manipulating scope inside of the link function, is that the shared scope, or is that a scope private to that directive?
At the moment, this scope is shared with all of the sibling elements of this directive. So in this case, since I have it inside of a repeater. Beach ball. Since it's inside of a repeater, each oh my, open. Wow. Yeah, that's what I get for using the TextMate 2 alpha for a demo. Sorry. All right. Yeah, actually, I reloaded this. So basically, when you configure a certain region of the page as a particular scope. If I was just to drop that directive as I had written it there, and the scope is totally shared. There is a way to make your directives have their own scope. That scope can either be straight inherited from the parent scope, or it can be isolated. I'll get to that in a bit. That's kind of an advanced topic.
Okay. Just a quick question. That element had a text function. I'm used to that from jQuery. Do you guys have your own custom element
interface?
Yes,
Angular comes with what they call jQuery Lite. If your page includes jQuery before it includes Angular, then they will instead use the actual jQuery, which is larger but also somewhat faster and a lot more featureful. But basically, for directives are the one place where you actually do start using like direct manipulations on the DOM. The kind of idea is that you want to put all of your DOM manipulation into directives, and that way your controllers and your services pretty much never ever have to touch that. Okay. So the digest cycle. This is a pretty fundamental topic in Angular. The digest cycle is basically the iteration of detecting it, like dirty checking for changes, applying those changes, doing repeated dirty checks until everything stabilizes and then returning the control of the flow to the event loop. So basically, whenever I was typing stuff into the text field before, so kind of new example here. Basically, the Angular was handling those events, triggering a dirty check, noticing that in fact, because I just typed something, the scope was dirty, updating everything relevant, and then doing another dirty check after that to see if the things that had done the updates had themselves made the scope dirty again. In that case, they wouldn't have, and then refreshing everything to the DOM once that's all done. So we need to deal with this rather directly in our widgets because we might be, well, we're definitely going to be updating the DOM in response to all sorts of things, be they user-triggered events or updates or, scope watch functions firing. So an important thing there is that see if TextMate crashes on me again. So let's say I want to detect clicks in my directive. Angular comes with a bunch of directives that are handy for doing event handling, but sometimes there's a lot it's missing. One of the more esoteric ones, if you want to detect like dragging or certain like mobile specific hover events or something, or not hover, like touch events. A lot of stuff is missing. So if you want to implement your own widget that has that uses some of these features, you'll probably use jQuery, some library to detect these events, and then you'll make some change to the scope. But if you don't hook into Angular's digest cycle, then Angular won't actually know that it needs to perform dirty checks because jQuery doesn't know to inform Angular of this, so we have to do it. So let's say let's take my element here. Element dot. So here I'm just simply updating the scope. So I've got this brought back the hello world directive. So basically I added this click handler to it, so I'm clicking on it, which should be adding Bob to the end of the string repeatedly, but it's not. And we can kind of peek into this and look that we're kind of part of the way there because I was updating the scope, but the page wasn't updating. I'm going to show you a little trick here. I inspected this element, and I can say secretly the Chrome console does this thing for you where it sets $0 to whatever element you're inspecting. So I can say angular.element, or if I was using jQuery, I could just say $$0.scope. And now I've got the scope of the element I'm inspecting. If we look in here, we should see that the name, in fact, right here does have Bob on the end of it. So the scope was being updated, but the UI wasn't. The key point here is that I wasn't actually telling Angular to do any dirty checking. I was just updating the scope. So if I do actually manually invoke a dirty check here, all of a sudden, UI will update. So right in here, all I would have to do is say scope.$digest. And if I do this again, yep. So there's an interesting issue here, though, because maybe you've seen this done a different way. Maybe you've seen it done scope.apply. Or you may have even seen it scope.$apply function. This would also work. So what's the difference between apply and digest? Apply basically forces the entire page's scope, like all the way from the top to update, to perform a dirty check and update if necessary. Whereas digest is local. Digest takes your current scope and its children and does a dirty check on them. So if you're not sure which one to use, apply is always safer. Like apply will always make the scope update by virtue of the fact that it makes all scopes update. But obviously that means also that all of your scopes are doing dirty checks, which can be costly if your page is big. So when writing directives, I would recommend trying to use digest whenever you can. Like pretty much if your directive is updating something inside of itself, then use digest. And if it's updating something like outside of itself, like say you have a select box widget and you've just chosen a different value, then you need to populate the outer scope, then you apply. You can save a lot of time, runtime that way. All right. So let's say, any questions about this before I move on?
What do you keep saying dirty check? What exactly does that mean?
All right. So the magic by which Angular sort of automatically does this two-way binding for you, like you change the model, you change the scope, the HTML, the DOM just magically updates. This happens because Angular basically looks at every expression you've created. So let's see what expressions we have here. We have name, name again, name, and leak. So basically, whenever Angular detects that something relevant has happened, then it does a dirty check. Basically means it goes through and says, has name changed? Has name changed? What? And has leak changed? And if any of them have, then it calls whatever handler is watching for that. Like under the hood, really, I've just done like if you actually were to dig into Angular and see what's happening here, at the end of the day, it's doing a $ watch on name here. So it fires the handler for that. That handler will do something. In this case, it'll try to update the view. And then it does another dirty check after that, after it's run all of those, because it figures those functions might themselves have dirtied the scope, or they might have made a change. So it keeps running those. If it encounters too many, then it'll, at some point it throws an exception that there's been some too much change in one digest cycle. But typically it'll run those until it stabilizes, and then the view will update, and the magic will have happened. Does that explain it? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Karl, just a quick question on digest.
Mm-hmm.
If you called rootscope.digest, would that basically cause all child scopes to digest?
Yeah, basically be the same thing.
Hey, Karl, can you switch back to where you have your directive code?
Yeah. Sorry, I had a bad merge when I...
Is there a benefit or a drawback in putting the scope.name plus equals Bob in a function within the controller and calling that function on the scope?
And applying?
So, I'm applying here. So this basically...
I'm saying remove the apply and just call a function on the
So separately you have a controller. So, well, that kind of depends on your separation of concerns, right? Because, ideally, you want to isolate your directive's behavior to have, your controller has its concerns and your directive has its own concerns. You can actually make so this is a very simple syntax for creating a directive, but you actually can define a directive that has its own controller as well, and its own template. So there are advantages to doing that. I was going to get to that later, but I guess I can talk about it now. Namely, obviously controllers, you expose your functions probably on a prototype. That means writing unit tests for them is a heck of a lot easier because you can just call those functions directly rather than having to create the directive and then perform whatever behavior it is and then try to suss out what it did. You can just call the functions as units. But generally speaking, you can have your directives called directly into your controller. And if your directive is basically designed specifically for the purpose of operating within some controller, you can do that. But if you want your directive to be more generic, then you kind of want to isolate those concerns as much as possible.
Thanks.
Actually, another thing you can do is if you have some kind of callback you can pass that. you can pass the callback in as an expression to one of the attributes of this element, and then it can read that out and then evaluate that expression in in response to some action. Anyone else? Okay. So there's some other interesting stuff you can do. Like basically, instead of returning a function here, I can return an object with all sorts of parameters in there. So since this is the link function, I'm going to call it link. If it was the compile function, I would say it was compile. And I can also do something like a template. So let's say I want my directive to be some kind of UI widget that's going to have its own DOM tree that it subs in. So the simplest way to do that is to just define your template right here, and then whenever you insert your directive into the page, this chunk of HTML will be inserted in there for you. So instead of saying this text hello world, I'm just going to say like, and then manually adding that, I can just say div. So, and then hello world is still here. So what if I can just approve it's happening? Indeed. Thank you, text me. So if I inspect this guy, we should see that, in fact, it does have that class I put on there, indeed. So similarly, since this is fine for its little one-line bit of HTML here, but if you had like a big, let's say 2 pages of HTML code you wanted to drop in, it would be a huge pain in the rear to put it in a string here, because like your editor's probably not going to syntax highlight it, and you could easily have mismatched quotes like I just did. So you can do like template URL and give it a path instead. To a file, and it will load that file when it needs it, and cache it accordingly. Similarly, I can say, controller, like, and that would just be like some class I made somewhere, and then it will instantiate that class as you'd expect, and then basically instead of having my code down here, I would basically define all the behavior in that controller. All right, so there's actually another little thing you can do called restrict. Basically, I can say restrict A. So what that does is basically says, so there's basically 2 ways you can have your there's probably more than 2 actually, but the 2 main ways you can have a directive are, it can either be like the element itself, like I can say like, instead of saying div with an attribute, I can just say like, my directive. So that would be an element directive. So if you only wanted your directive to work if it was referred to that way, you could put an E here for element. Or if you only wanted your directive to work as an attribute, you could put A. Or if you wanted it to work as either, you could say EA. We don't actually use that feature on my team, but I think it would be useful if you, for some reason, wanted to have like the same string work have different behavior if it was on the element rather than an attribute, or vice versa. All right. Any questions about that before I get on to scope isolation? Okay.
What is the, with respect to the template, if you have something complex, what is the recommended best practice for styling it? Do you create a separate style sheet
I mean, it once
for each directive?
Yeah, I would. On my team, we do. You run into like weird issues like how do you bundle that? Like Angular doesn't really help you at all with like the whole when to download which file. That's kind of a separate concern. So, but just for sake of organizing your code, it's a good idea to just have like your outer element have a particular class name that matches your directive name probably, and then in your CSS file say like, directive name space other stuff.
Thank you.
In your controller there, you directly referenced a controller. Could you show if that was injected in?
So if I wanted to inject basically have a dependency injected controller rather than refer to it in the global scope, sure. So right here we're using, I probably should have discussed this earlier, we're using dependency injection to grab parse. Under normal circumstances, Angular just does some magic where it can actually read the argument name out of this function and say, oh, I know what that is. If you wanted to use a controller as an injectable, you would need to first provide there's a separate function you call to basically create an injectable. So you would need to go through that and just basically to say I'm providing. You basically provide a factory for your constructor, which is kind of weird, but and then you would provide that, and then you can just refer to it by name here. So if your name was, and then it would inject your constructor, and then you could refer to it down here. Does anyone notice a problem? Anyone can think of a problem with this method of dependency injection? Sorry, what? Yes. So the way you work around that is if you are using minification, or even if you're not and think you might one day, you can instead of passing a function here, you can pass an array. The function is the last element in that array. And that way, I basically have a string here which will be preserved. So Angular will read this string instead of this argument. Say it's parse. Okay, I need to inject parse. And then even after it's minified and this thing turns into B1 or something like that, then it'll still be the actual parse service. So
for the template, if you have directives in your template, those get parsed automatically?
Sure, yeah.
What if you dynamically generate that HTML, right, in the template? How you can, or will the Angular still pick that up?
If I did some kind of string manipulation right here.
Maybe it's a huge, we encountered a similar problem in our application that we built a dynamic string of a table, and the table had directives in it. So we wanted a runtime, the Angular should read that HTML and make itself intelligent that there are directives there, and it should respond to those directives when the events occur. Let me rephrase this, right? So we build this table on the fly.
Yeah.
And the table has directives in it, like ng repeat and stuff, right? So we found that those were not getting picked up, or the events were not getting cached when we click on those cells.
Really? How were you defining? Were the events like ng click, or were they some
with
kind
ng click? Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm not really sure why that's the case, without being able to dive into your example, okay. But that should work, I would think.
So basically, we build the string dynamically, and then we inject that string, and it creates a DOM object of that.
Right, and you're passing that DOM string in using the template.
No, it's external. Here? We build this table without Angular.
Oh, okay. So you're just dropping this HTML string into your DOM somewhere.
Right, and it's a table string.
Okay, I understand the problem then. So basically, there's a service called $compile. So you would inject it. You can inject it into your controller, or you can inject it into directives or services or whatever. And basically, you would just say, if you add DOM or add elements to your HTML manually after Angular has parsed your page, then Angular doesn't know they're there, so they don't get included in this Angular system. But what you can do is you can basically where to type this. You can compile your DOM string. It also takes like if you have like an HTML node, like a DOM node, or like a jQuery element, it understands all those things. This basically tells it to go through this thing, create any directives that it asks for, do all that stuff, and there's actually 2 stages to it, because compile compile returns a linker. So to sort of tie these 2 ideas together, when you call compile on a DOM string, it goes through and finds all those directives and calls their compile step, which we discussed before, and then in order to link that to a scope, should have mentioned the compile stage doesn't have access to the scope. The scope hasn't really, like the point, like say if you're in a repeater, like I said, each stage of the repeater has its own scope. So when you're doing the compile step, which is the common step, we haven't seen those scopes yet. We don't even know they exist. So we do the compile thing here, and then to actually complete that, we have to call the linker and pass in the scope. So basically that will then go through that same block of HTML and I'll take all those directives and actually link them. So I think if you do that, you'll need, whenever you're adding like your own HTML stuff in, you're going to need to compile and link it manually using this service, because otherwise Angular won't know about it.
Right. One last question here is, you use this $compile service, right? But this is accessible only within the directives and the Angular framework, right? Is there somewhere where I can call it outside, like in some global JavaScript or something? I give a DOM object. How can I get a handle for $compile?
It's going to need to be. Is it possible you can put it in your controller? If that's like that's kind of like the outermost place you could put it.
Okay.
Would be to inject it into your controller.
And from control, I can still compile and do the same stuff, linker.scope?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'll try that out.
Yeah,
Thanks.
the compile service is also extremely useful in unit tests. That's kind of a different presentation entirely, but basically when you actually want to test out your directives, each unit test is probably going to have like a different string to fire off your directive in different configurations, and you $ compile that string and link it in order to actually test things from your unit tests.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, so I guess I can talk about a couple other things you can put up here. One of them is priority. Let's say. So this determines what order, like if there's multiple directives on a single DOM node, this will determine what order they go in. The default priority for everything is 0. And if there's multiple directives that are of the same priority, then the order they fire in is undefined. They'll all fire in some order. But if for some reason you have a directive that needs to fire before or after all the other ones, you can use this priority number. Higher is a higher priority. 101 is kind of a special number because 100, the interpolation thing, the thing that actually does the curly braces, happens at priority 100. So if you feel like you need to do your thing before that happens, then you need to go with 101 or higher. So that's useful sometimes. Terminal is another useful one. That defaults to false. And what that means is basically when it gets to your directive, it will know your directive will be the last thing that it actually evaluates on this DOM node. So any subsequent directives that would have been evaluated, like lower priority directives or same priority directives that happen to come after yours that time, or any contents of your DOM node, those will not be evaluated. So there's certain situations where this is useful depending on what kind of directive you're making. Like if you want to, if for some reason you want to do something with the contents that has nothing of this DOM node that has nothing to do with Angular, you can make it terminal and keep Angular from futzing with it. Let's see. All right, so probably another important issue is scope isolation, which I alluded to earlier. You have the ability to basically separate your scope in 2 ways. You can separate your scope from the parent scope. So like if you have your directive and you want it to have its own scope that isn't that does not prototypically inherit from the outside, so that you can make whatever changes you want without actually leaking those changes outside. This is good for reusable components. Then you can make an isolate scope, and there's several ways to do that. The simplest is to say scope here, pass it an object. Actually, first of all, if I was just to say scope true, that would create a scope for my directive, but it would be a child scope of the outside. So they would still be linked. This would still inherit from that outer scope. And I still might, if I wrote something to this scope, I might actually, if there was something of the same name higher up, I might clobber that based on the rules of prototypical inheritance. So that's useful sometimes, particularly if I do want to see stuff from a lot of stuff from the outside. I do want to interact with the outside, but I also want to be able to digest just on my own scope for performance reasons. That's useful. But a more powerful feature is an isolate scope. So if you pass in an object like this, you create an isolate scope. So if I just pass in an empty object like that, what it means is that there's no communication whatsoever between this scope and the higher scope. But normally, you actually do want to communicate in some way. So what you would do is basically say, like, name an attribute, and then there's different things you can do here. So basically, if you say equals here, that creates a two-way binding between this scope and the scope above. And that is done through, since I've called it title, that's going to use the title. Basically, this string makes it the title attribute, and this string is what it's going to be named in my local scope. So I can say in here, title equals, let's get rid of that. So basically what I've done is I've mapped between my local scope's title element and the outer scope's name by basically saying I'm going to I'm going to put this equals title thing here, which tells it to check the title attribute of that element. Oh, and then actually I have to use curly braces if you do this. So then basically I've said, right, the outer scope's name gets passed in as the title of this other guy, and that's good because, like, you can just say for the purposes of your directive, it cares about something called title, and then, like, every different use of your directive in the HTML, they can decide what that actually means to them. So in this case, it means name. In another case, it might mean some totally other variable. Let's see if I actually didn't screw it up. And I screwed it up. Anyway, basically that. So the other thing is transclusion, which is kind of a funny word, but what that means is, like, so if you think of isolate scope as like isolating yourself from the world above you, there might also be a world below you. Like, you might also have children, right? Children defined from the outside. So let's say, let me undo that since I screwed it up.
Your compiler is installed online free.
So, $sign. So yeah, would have screwed up because it didn't know how to eject that because that doesn't exist. That was probably it. Yes. So actually, I can put this back. So that should work now. Yeah. So basically, if I inside of here want to say if I have some kind of widget that's like a wrapper for other things, like maybe it's like a tab view. So I want to show like my widget creates the tabs, but I still have these inner elements that I display, or I want to decorate some inner HTML. But I don't want to like interfere with how they behave. I don't want to expose my scope to theirs because I'm totally unrelated to them. Basically, I can say transclude true, and then in my template here. I can say div g transclude, and that's just going to basically take the contents that were passed in and just dump them right into that part of my directive. So if I was making something more complicated, I would have to pick the right place to put that. But since this is just a simple little thing, let's see if that worked. Yeah, so there the other DOM node just gets put in, and it's compiled using a totally separate scope, and then any directives in there would behave as you've configured them to. I think that's all I have to talk about. I'm happy to take more questions.
I'm just curious, if you have, since part of the purpose of directives is to have reusable components, so if you have a component and you want to enhance it, does it ever make sense to have nested or somehow extend it?
All right. Well, so if you one thing you can do is if you specify a controller for your directive, then you can prototypically inherit from that controller and basically define other widgets that use the subclasses of that. If you want to have like related widgets, obviously a lot of people don't like inheritance. Maybe they'd rather do composition or something. But that's one avenue to code reuse. Probably the easiest avenue to some form of code reuse is by using controllers in your widgets instead of in your directives instead of defining all the behavior inside of that linker function right there.
In the API guide under forms is a section on creating your own custom validation, and it talks about including ng model. So in that section there where you have scope and transclude, there's another thing called include, and it includes ng model.
Yeah.
I read through that a couple times, didn't get it. I wanted to know what something like that could be leveraged for.
I've actually never used that feature. I remember it existing. You mentioned it. But yeah, basically you can hook into that to basically leverage ng model, and you basically provide like something that reads stuff coming in from the user and then also processes that and also processes stuff sending it back out to the view because a text box is two-way, right? So. Sorry, I can't actually be of more help with right at this moment.
How do you guys usually test directives? What's the best practice for testing them?
All right, so on my team, I guess I should have mentioned I work on DoubleClick Digital Marketing Manager Trafficking Front End. No, I didn't make up the name. Which is actually the biggest project at Google and probably the biggest project in the world using Angular at the moment. And actually, if you were here last month, my boss Mark presented on it. It's pretty cool. What we do is we use Jasmine, and currently we're sort of transitioning from JSTD to Testacular, which is like an Angular developed test harness. And so if you use a controller, then unit testing is very simple because your controller exposes functions on its prototype, and you just call those. You set up your preconditions and you call them, and you measure. You set your expectations, and they pass or fail. In the case of a directive that's simpler like this, where you're just having a simple little function that does something with the HTML, typically what you'll do is you'll basically call you'll inject $compile into your unit test. You'll use it to compile some HTML string that invokes your directive, and then maybe use some kind of DOM testing to see that it did what you wanted it to do. Ideally, you will not add your DOM string into the actual page's DOM, because that makes it run a lot slower, because then all of a sudden you invoke penalties for like redraws and stuff like that. Sometimes you need to do that if you actually want to test that your directive is like sizing something a certain way or like setting it in a certain position on the page, then you actually do need to do that. Unless you actually like make a thorough mock of jQuery or something, which is not fun.
Attach it to the DOM.
Ideally not. You should try not to attach it to the DOM, because that will make your tests run a lot faster. And I think for a vast majority of tests, you don't need to. So you should just be able to keep it as just a little.
How would you test the controller? How would you test the controller that's inside the directive?
Well, you can actually just, since basically, I don't have the syntax on the top of my head, but basically your controller will take some arguments. Basically, the attributes of the directive itself will be injected into the controller. So you can either create the controller in the same, like you can either create the directive in the same way using $compile, or you can actually, just call new controller and just pass in the arguments yourself, and in lieu of what it would be injecting, and to test it that way. Gives you some flexibility there.
Cool. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about how you would kind of divide responsibility between the controller and directive, especially when we're talking about like scope manipulation or something?
Yeah, so we're talking about like a page controller, not like a directive controller, right?
Right.
Yeah. So first of all, for DOM manipulation, it should like always goes in the directive. That's pretty much a no-brainer. Like you don't want your controllers doing DOM manipulation that like will lead to some. Like at that point, you may as well not even be using Angular if you're doing DOM manipulation in your controllers. As far as manipulating the scope goes, it kind of depends on like your vision for what your directive is. Like if your directive is particularly tailored, like particularly designed to work in like a particular page, a particular setup, then if you want it to mess with the scope also, that's fine. If it's something that's going to be more generic, then you should try to interact with the outer scope as little as possible. Like use the isolate scope, and I would definitely recommend looking on the Angular docs and reading more about isolate scopes, because there's several other modes. There's like a one-way binding mode, and I showed the two-way binding mode, and a couple others. But that gives you the ability to separate their concerns as much as possible. And if you're writing a generic component, you should definitely try to do that, because otherwise, somewhere, someday, you'll both use the same scope member and collide.
Thanks.
All right, I think that's it. I will cede the stage to the next speaker.
All right, so what's going on here is we work at HBO, and there's a couple of projects going on there where HBO really cares about SEO. So Angular, when it just kind of explain our problem. More or less, SEO is kind of an issue with JavaScript. When Angular executes this whole, compile linker phase, when you go get data, you end up with this code that's not really evaluated. It's kind of evaluated on the client side. So when a crawler like Google's Spider comes by and takes a look at the code, it actually doesn't really evaluate things, and that doesn't actually get cached. So when you search for something like an HBO series like Boardwalk Empire, you might not really get good search results that land on HBO.com. So that's kind of why we care. We want to fix that. Kind of out of order here. So we were trying to figure out, like, one of the guys at HBO kind of doesn't really like the idea of using Angular unless we can solve this problem. So we came up with an idea where we can pre-render this content kind of server-side. We also wanted to make sure that we didn't have any hash bangs. So like if you look at Angular's documentation, they want you to use kind of the hash bang URLs, which they consider the pretty way to deep link. That's kind of frowned upon. And we want to make sure that all subsequent requests, once you've loaded the app, they kind of work the same way a normal Angular app would work. So we also kind of as developers didn't want to have to deal with changing the way we write Angular applications. We want to just be able to modify the Angular application, hit refresh, and see things happen. So what we've kind of come up with is using PhantomJS to pre-render the content. So Phantom is this like headless browser, and we use Varnish, which is a reverse caching proxy, to cache up the content, speed it up. And we wrote a little Java hook to call the Phantom stuff. So, like a simple request coming in on the client side over here is going to go through Varnish, and it's going to hit our little Java application if Varnish doesn't return a cache hit. And it's going to delegate down to Phantom. And Phantom's going to call wherever our Angular code sits. Currently, we're talking about putting it on Nginx. I mean, that's kind of irrelevant to the point. And it's going to execute all the Angular and return the content to the client. And it's going to get cached in Varnish. So any other requests coming through are just going to grab it right out of Varnish. So if you don't know anything about Varnish, it's really cool. It's this like in-memory reverse proxy caching system. So like all of it's like in memory. So there's nothing like written to disk or anything like that. The rules are really simple to define. When you define the rules, they're like compiled into this like dynamically loaded C library and injected into the Varnish runtime. And for people, again, that don't know, Phantom is this like headless WebKit browser, so it can pre-render our content. And Nginx is just this fast HTTP server alternative to Apache. There's a lot of talk about it being better for like mobile clients because it doesn't have like this huge overhead of managing connections and stuff like that. So we prepared a little demo. So that's just to kind of explain the problem. And we'll just kind of make it really clear what's going on. So James wrote this really awesome little application that can show you what's going on. So I've got Varnish running on port 7000. I am mostly off the screen. Let's do one of these things. How about that? And so basically this is the Angular application running just right off of Nginx. So you can do things like filter the content. But if you kind of look at this, the key here is that, oh, that's not cool. Well, that's an example. That file, AME, doesn't actually exist. It's a parameter. So, but you look here, it's just like pretty normal ng include. It's not evaluated. You can't really see it, so Google would never be able to cache this content. But if you look over here, and we go through our little pre-render Phantom thing, and we kind of search here, one, like refreshing, passing that parameter down actually reloads the app, whereas it wouldn't on the other way. But you can see this is like pre-evaluated, so all the stuff is here. You can actually see the ng include happened, the repeater happened. But if you look back over here, it's, you've got this. This is just really simple Angular stuff. You can tell that it's just not loading. Oh, can't even show you that. But basically the deal here is that we've used this really simple PhantomJS thing. And so it's pretty simple to do this. This is the Phantom input to go and do it. You just basically pass in the URL that you want to cache, and it creates this little web page object. The parameter is the URL that you want to load, and it just loads it. We actually just write it back to the console, which the Java process that invokes this just returns it right back to Varnish. And the Varnish config is relatively straightforward as well. You kind of have to point to the thing that calls Phantom, which is this, and you could do this like with Python or Django or Perl or whatever you want. You could call Phantom, and then you've got to point to your web server. So all our web server's just doing is hosting up the app that you wrote. So we were kind of hoping to put this in front of people that are writing Angular apps, because there's really no solution for this currently. I think there might be something in the works, but we just want to hear other ideas, as to how to solve this problem, and you might have other input, but interested to hear what you guys have to say about it.
So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the app, and then I'm going to talk about how a little bit that Adam covered it pretty well, but I want to talk a little bit about.
Watch this.
I'm going to talk a little bit about how we used Phantom and a little bit about how you can use Phantom at home. I'm assuming most of you don't have an enterprise server stack running. Well, I'm talking to the wrong crowd. Most of you probably do, but I'm sure a lot of you would like to run this example or work through these kinds of examples and get a feel for how server-side rendering would work without having to invoke an enterprise server stack. So for this particular example, we didn't do it, but in a lot of our original testing, we ran this application on top of a Node.js server. And in running it on top of a Node.js server, it allowed us to invoke I forget what the Node thread calling or the Node process calling library is called, but we basically invoked a Phantom process, and just like you saw in that code, returned the compiled HTML to the console, read the console in, and then just used the Node server to fire it back up. I'm putting this example up on GitHub, and I hope to add the Node.js stuff to it so that you guys can play with this at home. It's really, really cool the way it works. One of the reasons we went with this site is because we wanted to show you guys an incredibly dynamic site, a purely dynamic site. We've been really scared, I guess, as developers, or perhaps managers have been scared to let developers write these highly dynamic sites for public-facing, content-heavy applications, rightfully so, because a great deal of revenue is driven from from spiders and from search engine results. And we really do think we've nearly completely solved that problem if you have enough control over your infrastructure. We even went so far, and Adam did an incredible job when we were doing this, thinking ahead and building in, including Varnish so that we could cache this generated code without having to call the Phantom process over and over and over again. This allowed us to keep the Phantom process short-lived. That's probably one of the other really big concerns that you may get if you attempt to introduce this into your stack, is somebody somewhere is going to go, I'm not firing up a Phantom process every time somebody calls our web app, and they don't have to. That Phantom process can kind of sit anywhere, in anywhere you choose, and it only has to run the first time a page is called, and then this information is cached. And it's obvious to see how this could actually lead to some performance gains, because now you have a good reason to develop sound caching practices.
With regards to Phantom, one of the major concerns with it was the way we're kind of calling it. So it's this thing that's like meant for testing, and the way we're calling it, or the way you would call it with Node or anything, is you've got to like invoke this command line process, So we're calling Phantom here, calling Phantom by generating this like process builder and actually invoking something. And this is running in something I use called Drop Wizard. It's the Yammer guys created it, but either way, like I think invoking command line stuff from within like a web app is kind of I don't know about running that way. So we have to come up with a good way to do this. But I mean, the reason Varnish is there is because you don't want to like have some new piece of content out and then have like millions of people decide they want to access your site and fire up this like command line process all at the same time. So really, the first person in would end up firing it off. Yeah, I'm sure this could be made much more robust, and it's more of a just kind of like validation. We'd be interested to hear like, has anybody else done anything like this, or is anybody doing any kind of like public-facing Angular stuff? Yeah.
I've done some public-facing Angular stuff, but I haven't done anything with an SEO solution like this. So first of all, let me commend you, because this is definitely a solution to a problem that exists. People have asked me what the solution is, and I've said, oh, well, I guess we could do some sort of server-side rendering, but that was just conceptual. Obviously, you've actually done something in practice, so I give you kudos for that. Questions I have is any of this going to be open sourced? I know you said it's going to be on GitHub.
I mean, I've actually checked. So like the Angular Phantom renderer stuff, you know, originally wanted to show this demo with the stuff we came up with at HBO, which was like taking the Angular app we did there and like kind of showing that off, but we were told we couldn't do that. So I took the part that's just related to Phantom and just this little drop wizard business and kind of on HBO and checked it into GitHub. So
I was just kind of curious, what are you using to recognize when you've got a robot or a spider and giving them the pre-rendered stuff?
Basically, we just assume that anybody coming in is going to get the pre-rendered content. So the first page load you get of the Angular app, no matter how you access it, is going to be pre-rendered.
And then,
any subsequent thing you do to
that was
interact,
actually exact in the theoretical solution I gave somebody. That's exactly what I said. Just pre-render everything, and then when they click from there, you go.
The funny thing is, like in theory, that seems really easy. Like we thought we were going to do it with Node. And we spent a few days messing around with that, and we were like, oh, this is like a full-time job, maybe re-implementing WebKit or whatever in Node. So,
well, I definitely will take a look at it. I don't have anything more to say than I will have to take a deeper look at it, so I look forward to seeing those things. Cool. Thank you.
And one of the things that that I should reiterate is one of the advantages that we've kind of theorized in loading it every single time somebody visits is that this is now content that's not going to have to be analyzed by Angular when it's loaded, right? This is something that's not going to have to run. So there's a possibility that if we keep refining this, there's some, at the very least, small performance advantage to pre-rendering this.
You're also going to have to see if your backend data has changed, though, and you have to recache, re-render, recache.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's talk of like invalidating the cache and all this sort of stuff when the data changes. The lucky thing at HBO is that we kind of know there's a schedule, and so. But yeah, I mean, something more dynamic might matter.
How are you instantiating, once you've pre-rendered the HTML, what instantiates the Angular? Like if you deliver that to...
Yeah, I mean, it's really, you don't write anything different. I say that minus one thing. Let's see if I didn't open up there it is. I think this is it, right? Yeah, so, you know, same deal, you know, that you're used to. This is just a simple little Angular app, NG app. Same thing, just however you write your Angular app, it's just going to evaluate it. And we have tried it with some more complex stuff than just a partial and a you know, the search partial. If you look at this guy, it's that's just an NG input with some NG model. And then I believe you had a list. Where is that bad boy at? The list partial. Yeah, I mean, that's got his NG repeat in it. So, I mean, it was just kind of, these were a couple of examples where we were seeing they weren't being evaluated. But, I mean, the app that we've got at HBO has directives in it and all sorts of other more complex things. And it seems to handle it pretty well. There are some minor things, though, like certain things don't render exactly the same in Phantom. You notice that.
Yeah, I noticed that. And I think the one thing that you have to think about is that what's happening on the background is being rendered by a WebKit browser. Right, so it's going to be rendered in a WebKit way, and what we did, or one of the things we did to hopefully mitigate this, if it becomes the way we actually do things, is we using Testacular, we built PhantomJS into as one of our testing browsers in Testacular. So every time we fire off one of our tests, we're running PhantomJS alongside with all of the other browsers. That takes care of some of the JavaScript differences. That helps us catch in some of the JavaScript differences. But there are actual DOM there's some subtle, but
most of them I think are SVGs. I think because like the backgrounds behind like the search input at the top right corner of HBO or whatever looks a little different in the Chrome rendered version versus the one that came out of Phantom. But,
point being, there might be a little bit more work to make things consistent. I think, so.
Hey, that makes sense because Phantom is like completely different. But more on the infrastructure side. So you guys have two apps essentially, right? Because Varnish hits the Java app, and then the Java app has to go to Node and essentially render the actual application app, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the one that we're kind of talking about for, let's see here, I can go back. Yeah, so in the real one that we're going to do, I think one of the guys was like, hey, let's try Nginx. So we've actually successfully gotten rid of Varnish. I still think Varnish is a really neat technology, but you can set up Nginx as a reverse caching proxy. But the concept of Varnish is awesome. But it's just, yes, there is like a couple of apps, like this little Origin app thing. That's got to be built in like Node or sort of something.
Well, it's great that you brought up the Nginx question. So how do you get Nginx, sorry, completely not Angular related, how will you get Nginx to essentially build your first app and then have that app render your HTML?
Yeah, so
because I see it here.
So Nginx is more or less like right here. Right, like
at the end.
Right there. So it just holds Angular, and then the Phantom stuff. All this can live on 3 different boxes, and this Origin app can just call over to Nginx, right? So it's a separate box. The thing that's actually like rendering out the HTML, that's Phantom, and it's just like as if you just navigated to the Nginx box and grabbed the Angular app. It's just doing it kind of like on the server somewhere. And then it just generates the HTML and shoves it into Varnish. We could save like a piece of infrastructure by making both Nginx do reverse caching and the serving of the content.
Cool.
Do you have a way of kind of seeing what the search engine sees when you have all the Phantom compiled stuff coming?
Yeah. So that's what I was trying to show, and I don't know if it was really clear, right? So 7777 up here, this guy, this is the Nginx served content. So if you look at this, if you were to just hit, if a web crawler were to hit this thing, this is exactly what it would cache up, which is like, man, what are you going to search in that? So but if you hit the one that goes through, through this guy, you can actually see that like if it saved this HTML, this is the view source, not like the inspect element. So it's all evaluated. It's all you saw the repeater, right? So this guy was this list partial is a div with an ng repeat tag in it, iterating over all the videos. And
people will run like some analysis on the page, so it doesn't like look at almost everything. So that's something spam.
Yeah.
So do you know that like the search engine like actually goes through all of the pre-rendered fields?
Well, we haven't actually indexed any of this stuff, but there, I know what you're saying, but there in this content that's being returned from the PhantomJS rendered instance, nothing is hidden, right? I mean, and I don't think Angular works that way, right? Angular doesn't work by hiding things and exposing things based on whether or not a scope variable is active. Angular works on actually changing the DOM itself, right? And so everything is there. It's not none of those old tricks that Google looks for to delist you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other part is that all traffic has to hit this. No, it's not like if you're not Google, we serve up the regular old Angular app or anything. We just serve it up. We want to just serve it up pre-rendered to everybody.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question. So my follow-up is, if I imagine you have some kind of build process, and I'm wondering if there's an advantage to using kind of the cache miss response instead of just
building it all into that inline template?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the problem with a build process in this situation would be the content's like constantly changing, like 3-4 times a day.
So the templates themselves need to be recompiled?
No, I mean, but the content that's in there, right? Like if it was like a list of all the series or movies or anything in HBO, that changes constantly. So that's not like built into our static. It's not like statically built in. That comes from a service.
So you'd be probably trying to not re-index those templates if you could see that it's not a search engine, or is that not even an issue?
I don't know, Charlie.
So we're a little bit unique at HBO in that we know exactly when certain content is going to change. And one of the things we discussed was basically we can trigger a batch job that re-renders these pages. You can think of it as just rendering static HTML. And at that point, we know exactly when certain things are going to change, and we can trigger the updates of those static pages.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two approaches we have talked about. One would be where we just, so the argument is like server-side or thick client. And one of the guys is kind of saying, well, when I worked at Time, I could just run this script and it would generate the entire site with a script. And I was like, well, if you really want to, we can generate a list of all the URLs that would ever come in this site and generate the entire site and get it into the cache in one place, or we can do it like this, which is kind of on demand. When something requests it, it gets rendered into the cache. Both are depends on why you would want to do either.
So there's no JavaScript on the client, right? It's pure HTML. Is that accurate?
No, there's plenty of JavaScript on the client. I mean, it's an Angular app. It's just we're trying to make that first request, not require that you go make all the service calls to go fetch all the things that populate the page. We're kind of pre-fetching that and putting it into a cache.
Okay. Sorry, I was completely misunderstanding.
It's all good. Yeah.
Have you done anything with AJAX calls? Will Phantom request AJAX things and then wait until that's done before you return it?
It does a pretty good job of doing that stuff. I mean, and configuring Phantom to do that stuff was as simple. I mean, we tried a bunch of different render JS inputs, but this little render JS seems to do a pretty good job. The one that you wrote.
Yeah.
And
it's also worth mentioning that if you look right here in this page.evaluate, inside of this page.evaluate, we have access to the DOM, right? We can mess with the page here. So we can say, look, we have a big data set that we need you to make sure you have before you spit this page back up the chain. And once you have that, return the outer HTML of the HTML tag here and print that out on the console. So we can, if we chose to, manipulate the DOM completely or write any JavaScript we want inside of this this page.evaluate function. And I don't know if we've mentioned this, but the code you write to manipulate PhantomJS is JavaScript. I mean, so it's basically Node-ish. I mean, I don't know if it's actually Node that PhantomJS is using, but I mean, it uses require modules and all of that. You're writing anything you wanted to do with the DOM can be manipulated inside of this callback. So.
Right. I think a lot of people use Phantom to test their app and stuff like this, but this is really great because you could use it to also pre-render your content as well. So there's a bunch of questions, I guess.
Yeah. Sorry, me again. I'll let someone know. Let's go. So after the initial page request, that's just an Angular app filtering?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's just sure. I mean, the internals of it. He just made it so if you want to search on a movie, it's not re-requesting or anything. It's just filtering down the content.
The rendered page has no idea it was pre-rendered. It becomes a normal Angular app after it comes back to you.
Let's see if this still works. So, a really neat side effect of this was that you can, you searched on this thing, but if you refresh it, there's no web. There's you're going to get a 404 out of Nginx because that file doesn't exist. But the cool thing about kind of pre-rendering it and caching it is it's kind of there. You know, like that file kind of pseudo exists. There's a pointer to it.
Yeah. One more curious question. So on the refresh, that one actually goes through the whole process. Do you find that to be slow on the whole entire render process of the second page request?
It's actually not going through a whole process. It's cached.
This one? Well, it's not cached until someone actually refreshes it, right?
The first time.
Yeah, I mean, the first time.
The first time. Yeah, I mean, if we tried something else like that we haven't done. I mean, that right there, that was cached, right? So trash shaw. Yeah, so that put that key in the cache. But if we were to like do this, see what happens.
Yeah.
So that's never even been cached. Yeah.
Alright, so Angular is basically like compiling and doing everything it needs to do like twice, right? Because it's doing it like once, then you cache that, then spit it back, and then when it renders in the browser, it's rerunning everything. Is
I'll
that
give you
correct?
my honest answer, and I think that we've seen that it defers it the first time. I'm not really sure, but it seems like it's not re-executing everything once it pulls out of cache. But I could be wrong. It is.
Think of it in this fashion.
Because you don't have to run any JavaScript to see what the page looks like, your page is actually going to appear much faster to your end users.
Well, my question was not about speed so much as like, have you run into any problems related to like all that compilation code run twice, or like your directives executing twice?
Oh, totally. Yeah, we have. Like, so you know, the way we worked around, like, I've even seen that. So it's really, I didn't know if we were going to get into this, but the way that caching works is I've exposed this parameter, and it is this push state parameter. So you have to get this push state parameter. So when you're caching, this is kind of some of the output. Let's see here. So this is the thing that calls Phantom. So when a request comes through here, it actually has to generate a URL inside of there before it calls Phantom. And the URL has to be of this kind of structure. It has to add the non-HTML5 push state hash and turn push state off. By default, our app has push state turned on. So with that, when you don't turn it off and it loads, push state's on. So when you actually load this version after it comes out of the cache, push state's on. It actually totally breaks if you don't do this. Like, it just infinitely reloads the app, and it'll crash your browser. And then the other stuff we saw was that, like, I think we were getting a lot of duplicated rows. I can't really remember exactly why we were getting the.
Yeah, we ran into an issue.
NG repeats.
We ran into an issue, and I'll have Charlie explain it a little better after this. But we ran into an issue in which if you didn't include your Angular markup, if you didn't put your Angular markup on the page with ng includes, it would repeat. It would basically repeat every element with repeater on it.
Yeah,
right?
here's the example, right? This thing.
Right.
Right. So
Exactly.
if you just had like the contents of search partial right here, then you would actually like let's say you had 100 items on the page. The next time you refresh, you'd have 100 times 100 items on the page.
Right. Which was fun to watch.
It actually gets really slow.
Yeah. But
yeah.
Yeah. Well, but this is one of those problems that in practice turned out to be a bit of a non-issue, because that's not how you should write Angular apps. If you are creating a control, you should put that control inside of some sort of partial or template. So that one we got around pretty easily. We sat there for I think like a day or two, like, well, this doesn't work.
This sucks.
and then Charlie was like, you put it in include, and he put it in include, and then we got to look smart again.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So when you receive a request for a URL that's not cached, do you create a new Phantom instance, like a new process that goes to Phantom?
Yeah, so I think that's probably the biggest pushback we're getting, right? So I mean, like this, if you know much about the Java stack, you've only got so many execute threads, and then, but I mean, we're kind of mitigating that because, hopefully people shouldn't be calling the same thing, and that varnish or the reverse caching proxy varnish or Nginx, however you do it, it's just a big hash map, so it should should fill up and serve requests for the same thing over and over again. And then we also talked about that, like priming the pump that you were mentioning. If we pre-render everything when content changes, really you should never end up calling Phantom. The primer script or whatever should do that for you. So that should all kind of happen behind the firewall.
Right. But so in this example, like in the JavaScript that calls Phantom, could you potentially reuse that page object to navigate to different pages and like keep rendering the content? Like, do you have to instantiate a new page to go to?
I don't know. We could probably look into that. I mean, I think, the way it's working right now is the thing that actually invokes Phantom is this Phantom resource, and this is a Java class, and it builds this process builder, and then it actually like executes the process, kind of like you typed it into a command prompt and hit return. So you can't like keep piping more URLs into it. It just kind of runs and returns.
It's worth mentioning that our solution is not production ready.
Yeah, we just kind of threw this together in like a couple of days.
Yeah,
and we're kind of entertaining.
Yeah, I'm not trying to like say it's slow or anything. I was just going to say you could potentially create just a node service that given URL gives back the HTML and just pull those. And have a few of those that are just sitting there waiting for stuff.
Yeah, this was created as a proof of concept. Although we did, I personally kind of like the idea of keeping a short-running Phantom process because we didn't know much about Phantom when we started this, and if that thing goes down, when a spider happens to be crawling by, it's an issue.
I mean, that's actually the biggest sticking point for anybody kind of reviewing the solution. And if anybody knew of an alternative we could plug in right here that would do the same thing, we'd definitely take a look at it.
I can see using like a guard process to watch.
Is you talking to Mike?
I could see like using guard to watch the files for like when they change, and then like kind of proactively making the templates.
Okay.
You guys like
maybe would work. I mean, I think primarily like the problem I guess there is that like the content doesn't live in a file. It's like in some database that we don't really have access to from the stuff that we get.
Stored procedure.
Yeah.
I was going to ask about production stuff, like does your reverse proxy handle the dogpiling? What happens when a script kiddie runs 5,000 URLs against your
I think that's really the stuff that these the production guys are asking us questions about, and we're kind of like, that's your job.
I know for a fact that Varnish will handle stampedes, so it won't actually trigger multiple times. It'll serve stale content until it returns the proper new content. So I know Varnish can at least handle a stampede problem for you.
The other thought that one of the guys had was if we had like new content coming out, right? The assumption is that Varnish is just going to return all the content. But when new content comes out, we kind of expire the cache on our side and repopulate the cache. So like the order with which we do that should mitigate people coming through and getting to Phantom. I don't think anybody's worried about Varnish or Nginx as a reverse cache proxy. I think they're worried about too many people invoking Phantom on the same thing and causing like collisions. Yeah. Oh, that's the same thing. That's what that means. Gotcha.
Have you thought about what you would do if you wanted to also serve like custom user content on that page?
Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, we've thought about it.
I mean, think about it. If I log in as myself to HBO, like, does Google really give me like? Does it crawl as me and cache that stuff up? I mean, I don't really know how that would work, but I mean, the whole point of this is for SEO purposes, I think.
Yeah.
So like personalized stuff, really, I don't think.
So you would want for when Google was crawling it, you would want it to act like an anonymous request.
Yeah.
But then if a user logged in, would they get the page rendered for an anonymous user by Phantom, and then how would they get their own content?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we discussed kind of deferring some of that stuff. It might act different when you're logged in. I mean, there's only a couple of things in HBO's scenario that are personalized. I think when you get logged in and you're like younger than 13, you get penalized. You don't get to see the late night content, and then you can't like navigate to your profile and stuff. But
currently the way it works,
So currently, the way this works is that you would get the SEO crawlable page. It would show up, and then Angular would kick in, and it would overwrite it. So you get your personalized content. The issue there is you might see some screen flicker. So we're really thinking hard about that, how to organize our content so that it doesn't impact that what the users see immediately when the screen initially renders.
I actually know, now that I think about it, with Varnish, you can send it to send the request to a different web server or not serve a cache page based on if they have a cookie, like a session cookie.
Yeah, I mean, that's what this bad boy is doing right here. So, I mean, you can write these rules, like in this VCL receive, and set the different backend to be different things. So, I mean, you could detect, you can look at headers, you can do all sorts of stuff. That's where you would do it, I think.
Yeah, so you could send them to a non-PhantomJS web server, so they just get the regular Angular template if they're logged in.
That's true.
I just wanted to comment on a couple other things. As far as the hashbang URLs go, right now by default they're only used as a fallback when the user is using a legacy version of Internet Explorer. So the default is that it uses the newer push state stuff. So that shouldn't be much of a problem going forward. And I don't know the specific details of it, but the Angular guys are working on some kind of server-side rendering thing. I mean, this is really cool, don't get me wrong. I'm actually really impressed with what you did. But yeah, there is some kind of, this is on their radar. And I think before the end of the year, they're hoping to have some kind of server-side rendering.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole point for us was we didn't know about that, and this has been great because we've kind of exchanged a couple of emails with Igor, with you guys, and he said something about that. We weren't sure if it was going to be something just for Google, or if it was going to be something that was something for Angular. We would be happy to test it. So if anybody wants us to look at some alpha something,
it's kind of been a hot topic internally just because it makes the if you do it fast, you can make the app feel a lot faster. This way, which would be Google's main motivation, but obviously your guys' motivation is great.
I mean, it's definitely on one portion of our architecture is kind of a deal breaker, whether we get to use Angular or not if it doesn't do this. So.
It's also worth mentioning, if this hasn't been transparent enough, that this solution has absolutely nothing to do with Angular.
Yeah.
So it's
I mean, it would work.
It would work on any JavaScript.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Does Phantom, if something were to error out, if something were to go wrong while Phantom's rendering the page, does it just cache that error page, or?
That's an interesting question. I don't think we've banged away at it hard enough to test that. But if it returns a string from Angular, it will cache that string and match the key. So if the key is the URL, then it's going to return whatever the bad content is. So
in both the PhantomJS code and the Node.js code that I wrote, I built some error checking into it that would send back slightly smart things, but not smart enough. So
it would need to be improved.
It would need to be worked on.
With Varnish, you can actually trigger. You could do a post.
Retry?
Well, you could do a post object return when there's a failure to not expire the cache and leave it in cache until you're done, and then expire the cache when the page comes back fully rendered and without any errors. So VCL, the one interesting thing about Varnish is that you basically have a fully exposed API for how you can, so you can just telnet in.
So that's definitely a selling point for Varnish. I don't know in comparison to Nginx's hooks, if they have all those features, but I mean Varnish looked awesome. I'd never heard of it until somebody pointed it out for this project.
They both do it, but the good thing about having Varnish separate is that it doesn't really be in the video. Is that it's actually separated from your application server. So when your app fails, you can have your app fail, and Varnish can actually keep serving content. It's not Angular related. I like keeping them separate because Nginx could die, and you can keep serving content through Varnish, the stale content.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right.
I would imagine they want you to use a microphone.
I like the argument about having like two separate boxes, but Nginx, in my experience, is a little bit like it's been pretty much a Varnish replacement plus for me, because like I can proxy directly to other apps, like right in Nginx, and it acts like as a reverse cache.
Yeah, I mean the reverse caching proxy config for Nginx is actually. Did I leave it in here? I think so. It's this part right here. And it's really simple. The thing I saw that was weird is like Nginx actually, let's see, I can zoom in, is like a disk-based cache. But Varnish, when you start Varnish, you can like, let's say you've got a machine that's got like massive amounts of memory on it. You could allocate this like huge block of memory to the cache, and it'll just keep everything in memory. So you're not going to have like disk I/O issues unless you just really blow that cache up. So that was a neat feature of Varnish. I don't know if it's a selling point, because one of the things the HBO production guys are thinking is like, we don't want to introduce more technology unless there's a really good reason. And Nginx, if it can kill two birds with one stone, they would kind of rather just have one.
I'm not going to know exactly for sure, but when I tested against Varnish and Nginx, like they had really similar performance characteristics against like those like lots of pages that you would expect to be in the memory.
Okay.
Yeah, it's weird. Nginx is slightly faster even on this space, which is very weird.
Weird.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Thank you guys for giving us feedback.